Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please. First of all, a very, very warm welcome to you for this session. Apologies, you were meant to get Becky Anderson from CNN, but she's busy being a journalist at the moment, so you've got me. My name is Karen Allen, and I'm going to have to try and double up for being a moderator and a panelist at the same time. So I think it's very much in the spirit of journalism. We're multitasking increasingly, so perhaps we shouldn't be too fazed by that. But welcome to everybody on this very important subject. We're looking at the protection of journalists and the promoting of independent reporting. In this session, we want to tease out the issue of the importance of independent reporting to be able to give unbiased factual information, unbiased reportage, and to give information on humanitarian crises, not only to those who are having to shape the resolution to those crises, but also the people who are, as we would say in the business, who are living the story. And it's also important to get access to independent, clear reportage for those making life and death decisions, those for whom the stories are about. Where do they go? Who do they vote for? Where do they go to their place of safety? Those kinds of stories. And for many of the people here, it is our bread and butter to try and tell those stories. But we also want to touch upon the issues of challenges of insecurity faced by journalists around the world. And we know from the Charlie Hebdo attack that you don't necessarily have to be in a conflict zone to feel the sharp end of conflict. At least 15 journalists have been killed so far this year, and the start fact is there are going to be many, many more before the end of the year is out. 100 journalists were killed last year, according to Reporters Without Borders. We have a representative here that we'll be hearing from a little later on. And we're seeing more and more impunity with the imprisonment of journalists in the Middle East, in North Korea, in places like Ethiopia, and yes, I'm afraid also here in Turkey, which makes this session especially timely and especially pertinent. We've got a wealth of global experience from all of our panelists here, but let me not waste any time further, and if we can begin, I'd like to start with opening remarks from Vusat Doğan. She is the chairwoman of Hurriyet, which is the leading media platform here in Turkey. Straight after that, I will ask Irina Bokova, the Director General of UNESCO, which has taken a lead on the issue of protection of journalists, to give her presentation. So first of all, to you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished guests, panelists, I welcome you all to our beautiful country, my home, Turkey. Today, humanity is going through one of its most challenging times. Political instability and climate change affect vast majority of people. And media's role is vital, especially in crises like this. In order to get to the heart of the problem, public needs unbiased, accurate reporting about what's going on in the field. This is an absolute necessity to grasp the whole picture. However, we know it's not easy. The war zone reporters put their lives at risk for information. Too many journalists have killed while doing their job in the past. Ms. Allen just mentioned some figures about it. So as a representative from Turkey's leading independent media group, I take the opportunity to first thank United Nations for its efforts in the plan of action in order to protect journalists against threats, as well as setting up programs for their protection and training. However, we know that this is not easy, and this is not enough. Governments, business leaders, civil societies, we all have to step up and lead and turn words into actions. And I think this panel today is very crucial for that means. Media has yet another vital role in addition to independent reporting. And especially at times of polarization in almost every topic, and almost unfortunately in every society, it is even more important. We hear more and more segregating rhetoric and hate speech in politics, society, and media. For example, Islamophobia is a result of this. Division of such divisions create monologues rather than dialogues, and it makes it impossible to search for solutions to today's problems. On the contrary, media can provide a space where conflicting voices can express themselves and they can be heard without fear. In this case, in addition to our free speech and right to information, we all also contribute to social harmony, peace, and reconciliation that can only be achieved through seeing other people's dignity and right to be heard. Let me give you an example. When the Syrian refugee crisis started, most of us were busy with numbers. How many refugees and what are the implications of these on economics? Up until one day, a young photojournalist of Doğan News Agency, Nilüfer Demir, photographed this little boy's dead body on the shore. I'm sure many of you will remember it. And instantly, 3,000 publications published the same photo. And he became a symbol of humanity crisis associated with this refugee, with the refugee issue. And I think it also reminded us the first sentence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is every human being has the right to live in dignity. This example and many more show the importance of the role of media in the humanitarian issues, and that is why this panel about media being hosted in the Humanitarian Summit is critical. I look forward to the discussions and to many important voices to be heard at the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Without further ado, General Secretary of the UNESCO, thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I would like first and foremost to thank Ms. Vuslat Dugan-Sabuncu, the chairwoman of Hurriyet, for hosting together this important discussion. And I'm happy that we have ministers, experts, representatives of the media. I would say, as the United Nations agency that is mandated with the promotion of freedom of expression and the protection of journalists, we know the power of freedom of information and the power of freedom of expression. We know that it is essential for the rule of law, for good governance, and this is why we have been advocating strongly during the Agenda 2030 that this is included as one of the main, I would say, prerequisites for the sustainable development. But we know also that in crisis, this power is multiplied. In crisis, the free flow of ideas and information literally saves lives. Before crisis, it helps prevent and mitigate them. Mitigate risks, it bolsters resilience, and this is vital to take forward the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. During crisis, it shares vital information. It challenges rumors, it mobilizes public opinion, it empowers citizens, humanitarian workers, and decision makers to take informed decisions. And after crisis, it is vital for rebuilding to promote reconciliation and dialogue. Throughout, free and independent media are essential watchdogs for human rights violations. This is why we must defend the safety of journalists who face attacks, who face harassment, kidnapping, torture, killings. Tragically, we know that in the last 10 years, 825 journalists have been killed, and just today Karen mentioned that only this year there are 15 journalists that have been killed. Many deaths occur in conflict and crisis situations, but we know also that local journalists are hit hardest. There are 14 times as many local journalists killed as foreign correspondents. Impunity makes the situation worse. In 9 out of 10 cases, those responsible for the killings of journalists are never punished. This feeds fear and self-censorship. It limits the public's access to information. It weakens the ground to respond to crisis. And this global challenge requires global responses. This is why UNESCO submitted and is leading the United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the issue of impunity to create a safe environment for journalists in conflict and non-conflict situations, working with UN agencies, governments, professional associations, and the civil society. And this is why, as Director General of UNESCO, I stand up every time a media worker is killed and call for justice. I believe we are making headway. This starts with mobilizing awareness. 8 resolutions have been passed in the last few years at the United Nations General Assembly, the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and UNESCO. We see concrete steps at the national level. The creation of a coalition of media safety in Pakistan, the establishment of Media Monitoring Committee in South Sudan. In Iraq, UNESCO has built bridges between the Ministry of Human Rights, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Iraqi Journalists Syndicate. We helped train security forces on freedom of expression in Tunisia, in Nepal, Cote d'Ivoire, Iraq, Somalia, and South Sudan. Across Latin America, UNESCO has trained thousands of judges on freedom of expression and journalist safety through a massive open online course. These are strong steps, but we must do more. And I call always on everybody to commit to the United Nations Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity, because I am convinced everyone has a role to play. Governments can create national protection mechanisms to monitor threats, and I call on them to ensure swift investigation into crimes against journalists. United Nations agencies can share deeper information, combining action to take the UN action plan forward. And this is the interest, I believe, on the proposal to create a special representative of journalist safety in the office of the United Nations Secretary General to raise further awareness. Media organizations must ensure international and local staff have the right training and resources. This was the goal of UNESCO's conference in February this year, bringing together the heads of news organizations from across the world. As it is written in the UNESCO Constitution, promoting the free flow of ideas by word and image is essential for inclusion and justice, to foster sustainable development, to build lasting peace, especially in and after crisis. And this was the message we sent on World Press Freedom Day on the 3rd of May this year in Helsinki. I believe this is why this meeting today is so important, to enhance safety of every journalist, to end impunity for crimes committed against them as a vital part of responding to crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. You make the point about the actions that have started to be taken, and there has been a glimmer of good news, was that we have started to see, although proportionally it's very small, some prosecutions, maybe only 4 or 5, but some prosecutions of those who have been responsible for killing journalists, but still a long, long way to go. And I think to shed a little bit more light on the campaign to try and advocate more for journalists and to try and remind the world about the important job that journalists do. We're joined by Christophe Deloire from Reporters Without Borders. I know you've got something to say about that special rapporteur as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having in the title of this session the protection of journalists and the independence of journalists. Those two objectives should never be split. Point 1. What the international community should always have in mind. None of the main challenges of mankind, corruption, climate change, religious extremism, violence, economical problems, will find a solution without freedom of information. We have to prevent humanity from entering a new era of propaganda and of wars of information that are wars on journalism. Journalists are killed. 70 journalists have been killed in the course of their jobs last year. They are imprisoned. Unfortunately, the number of journalists who are imprisoned in the world is not decreasing at all, and we have to add now the figure, the same figure, that's to say around 160 of non-professional journalists who are also imprisoned. And we have also to add to visible prisons, more and more invisible prisons. That's really bad for our common future, because free, accurate and fair information is a catalyst of mutual understanding and peace. Point 2, what the governments should do. They have to set up press freedom as a priority, not only in their own territories, but also in their diplomacy orientations. Due to interdependence, what happens here, in that country, in this country, will have consequences there, in that country. If there would be free journalists in Eritrea, in this small country in the Horn of Africa, there would not be so many people fleeing the country and dying in the Mediterranean Sea. If there should be free journalists in Iran, and unfortunately the figure of journalists in prison in Iran is not decreasing, we would be more optimistic for the future of the situation of that country after the nuclear agreement and after elections. Also, the rest of the world will pay one day the price for press freedom violations in Turkey nowadays. Illegitimate procedures, illegal actions are run against the press in that country that endanger the capacity to solve regional crises. Turkey does a lot for refugees, but the journalists are prosecuted and condemned for terrorism for only doing their jobs. Should I refer for the Cumhuriyet journalists who just revealed the delivery of weapons by Turkish secret services to Islamist groups in northern Syria? In the east-southern part of the country, everything is done to control information. It raises tension, it provokes instability. That's a danger for the rest of the world. Point 3, last point. What should the UN do? A lot of resolutions have been adopted about journalists' protection since 2006 and by various UN bodies. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General himself, said that we have now a legal framework for the journalist safety, for the protection of journalists, but that the major challenge remain to ensure compliance with this framework. That's why a concrete mechanism has to be set up to oblige states, member states of the UN, to comply with their obligations. This concrete mechanism should be the creation of a new position of special representative to the UN Secretary General. This one should have the political weight to really oblige the countries. Please have a look on the Reporters Without Borders website to have more details. I have to say that this will be complementary to the UNESCO work, to the great work made by the UNESCO, but this position will in fact empower the UN Action Plan on the safety of journalists.
Christophe, thank you very much indeed. I have to say, in support of what Christophe has talked about, we're in an industry which increasingly is having to make the distinction between news and news not being a show. There is a very good video campaign that Reporters Without Borders have been running to make that distinction. And I say about that because our industry has gone through an extraordinary transformation. And if you'll give me a moment, this is where I have to step out of moderator mode and become a panelist, which in the interest of independent moderation is slightly complicated. But I think the point that Christophe makes is exactly that. News in particular faces a challenge of having to define itself as being distinctly different from entertainment in an industry which has undergone dramatic transformation. we sometimes see news conflated with entertainment. And in order to meet the demands of 24/7 news and the need for what we call content, sometimes huge compromises are having to be made. And the people at the end of the day, at the sharp end of that, are often the journalists who are gathering the material on the ground. And most of them, as we've heard, are not foreign correspondents like myself. They're independent journalists, or they're freelancers, or what we call stringers, who are there to gather the material. I've worked for the BBC for 20 years. And for me personally, I've lost friends and colleagues in Iraq, in Somalia, and Afghanistan. Now, these are high-profile cases, but of course, there are many, many more people on the ground, as we heard from Christoph, who are suffering for the sake of bearing witness. And that is why I became a journalist, to bear witness, to be there to testify to some of the things that we're reporting on, the little boy that we've just heard about being washed up on the beach. You know, in 2003, there was a big debate about how reporters could report conflict situations more safely. I don't think it is possible to report conflict situations completely safely, but you'll remember that in 2003 we saw the introduction of the embed system during the Iraq War. I was embedded with the Royal Air Force in Iraq. My colleague Terry Lloyd, who I shared a beer with on the plane just a week before, was unilateral. A week later, he was killed, and it subsequently turned out that he was killed by so-called friendly fire. It caused a ripple of nervousness among the journalistic community, among the industry, because people began to question this whole idea of embedding. It was very attractive. It protected your journalists, seemingly. It also gave journalists extraordinary access. But it was, of course, only a one-dimensional picture, and it was only available to a handful of journalists. What it's also done, though, is that it's created an environment that if there is no infrastructure to embed with, as is the case with the vast majority of journalists, is there an appetite to still cover the story? Is there still the appetite for mainstream media to cover the story, or do we push it to the young journalists who are coming out of journalism school, who are wanting to make their mark, who perhaps don't have the insurance and the infrastructure to protect them, to do the stories themselves? We are in a climate of risk aversion, which is perfectly understandable, but I warn people who are making the decisions about the future of news that we have to tread a very, very fine line between being able to tell the story and being able to have a risk-free environment. We need governments to understand the roles that journalists play. We need the public to understand the value of journalism. It's not a commodity. It's not something that we can compete with. It's something to be valued. And as a result, the kinds of action that we've heard called for greater training, for a moderator to try and help raise the profile of independent journalists, and also to bring to book those who have targeted journalists, I think that call is going to have a great deal of support. Just a couple of other very, very brief comments I want to raise. I know one of my colleagues from the DRC will touch upon the issue briefly about ethnicity in journalism. I work in Africa. I was the East Africa correspondent. I'm now the Southern Africa correspondent for the BBC. During the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007, I was switching fixers every single day, depending on the nature of the ethnic hue of that conflict. Again, a reminder that the journalists themselves are no longer the independent messenger, the independent bystander that was once the focus of the subject, don't shoot the messenger. They too need to be extremely aware of how they are perceived by the public. There is no longer a perception of independence, and I think that also has to be reflected in the measures that are taken to protect independent journalists. But just another final point. We're operating as journalists now in an environment of the global war on terror. And that, of course, can also pose one of the biggest threats to journalists by closing down freedom of expression of perceived opponents. We've seen it happen in Ethiopia. We've seen it happen in Kenya. We have also seen it happen in countries like Turkey. And I think this is a very, very dangerous escalation in the past 10 years, where we have seen reporting on issues such as corruption, on public procurement effectively being closed down under the guise of being a threat to national security. So I'd be interested to hear the views during the course of our discussions and the presentations as to how that is addressed. And I would suggest that if there is an action plan that is involving greater education of those who use the media and greater media sensitivity of our leaders, of our public, of our consumer, that it also is aware of that. But I talk about people taking enormous risks for their work, and I think nowhere could that be better encapsulated than our next panelist, who is Zeina Ahen. She is an independent Syrian journalist who's been feted for her bravery in reporting the developments in Syria. Over to you.
Well, I was asked to tell you about the challenges I'm facing while working inside Syria, and I think this is a very, very hard question. For me, it equals the difficulties of describing how does it feel when you're nearby a barrel bomb falling. How could I describe the sound? How could I describe the fear? Or this pain that comes directly to your stomach? Whether when you're thinking, is it going to be hitting me, the love of my life, or someone I care for? So as the answer is very difficult, I decided I'm going to be making it simpler, and I'm going to divide the challenges I am facing as a Syrian, a woman, and a journalist working inside Syria. Each of the three things that I mentioned is considered as a sin, a punishable sin these days, and I'm punished for it from different authorities. Because I am a Syrian journalist, I am forbidden from going to the most areas in my country. I can't go to any area that's controlled by the Assad regime because I've committed the crime of being a journalist. I am on the wanted list for 3 different security branches: the state, the military, and the Air Force. Although I can't really drive a bike, but the Air Force somehow find me so threatening. Because I am a journalist, I definitely can't go to any of ISIL controlled areas as well. So I only have 2 options: either to stay in the rebel-held areas and live under the barrel bomb of the Assad regime and the extensive Russian bombing of my areas, or do what is the most scary for most of your governments, which is immigrate illegally to EU, which is something I don't want to do. Because I am Syrian, and despite being a journalist, I am treated as a potential terrorist in every single airport I land at. I am always the one who's being asked to step on the side because I have this cursed passport, if I may say so. Only because I accidentally was born there, this is enough for the international communities or airports to consider me as a threat. I really don't know a better definition of discrimination but this. For being a woman, in the conservative societies that we're working at, which is so much militarized and masculine spaces, it's also very difficult for me to work, and the other journalists, women. We are forced to have a garden to move around. Everything is much more difficult for us compared to our male colleagues. But as well, some international NGOs are using the Syrian women, and they're using our voices to implement their own agendas through creating these initiatives and groups that don't actually represent the Syrian women, because the women thing is so Western friendly. So it's easier for them to actually advertise their ideologies through us. To speak quickly about the local citizen journalists I am training and I'm working with, and how they are being treated by the international media. I think it is fair to say that they are not respected at all. They are being used in many cases. They are insecure, uninsured, and although they are the main source of information for the last 5 years, they are not being treated as actual journalists. They don't get half of the payments that any of their international fellow is getting. When they are hurt or injured, they are left alone without any kind of help. I have many cases of those. Condemning and press releases are not directly affecting the citizen journalists who are working inside Syria. So how you can support Syrian journalists? I think first recognizing them, respect who they are and the incredible work that they're doing in these horrible circumstances. Urge your media institutions and your government to treat them fairly, maybe put some laws to do that. I think also urging the Turkish government to open the border for the Syrian journalists who are trying to cross back and forth from Turkey to Syria. This is also very important for us. And I think most importantly, stop the unbased discrimination applied on us just because we're Syrian. Being Syrian doesn't mean we're less human or more terrorist than any of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab. That very, very powerful description at the beginning. I think it will stay with many of us. Another representative of the mainstream media comes from Biz newspaper. The editor-in-chief is Tanit Kosh.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to start by expressing my respect to Zaina and all colleagues here on the panel and across the world who do not work from the safe haven of a Berlin newsroom, as I do. I was very touched by your remarks right now. And let me be very clear, the situation we're facing in Germany has nothing to do with the imminent threats to your life, the intimidation, and all the other risks you are taking for doing such an important job. I would also, as we are in Turkey, like to stress that I have very great admiration for our colleagues in Turkey who are doing an excellent job despite all odds, despite being threatened by indictment, despite facing prison for criticizing the president. I only met with a German-Turkish colleague yesterday who's still waiting for his accreditation since September, Deniz Yücel. There is another colleague from Spiegel who's already had to leave the country because he never received an accreditation. So please forgive me, but everything I'm going to say about Germany now is hardly comparable to the very many dangers and threats and challenges that colleagues are facing all over the world. Nevertheless, I was asked to touch the subject of Germany and Europe. Only this morning, my colleague Paul Ronsheimer was marched off by 2 policemen in Greece because he had the cheek to want to report from the refugee camp of Idomeni. All journalists were asked to leave that camp this morning at 3 o'clock and were escorted from the camp, and 3 of our colleagues went back at 5 o'clock and were hiding in tents in order to cover the clearing of that big refugee camp, and fortunately they managed to cover it. And this only shows that even in the heart of Europe, press freedom is not taken as or not regarded as highly as it should be. Coming to Germany, finally, we are facing 2 very acute challenges at the very moment. First of all, there's a rise of right-wing populist movements that very much feed on a narrative calling the press the lying press, Lügenpresse, and also feeding on hate speech on the social web. This verbal abuse, or what used to be a verbal abuse at first, turned into a physical abuse during many demonstrations when journalists wanted to report from the Pegida movement rallies. First there were chants of Lügenpresse, and then colleagues were attacked physically. So this is one of the reasons Germany was ranked down by Reporters Without Borders from rank 12 to rank 16. And I do feel that a country such as Germany should not be behind Jamaica, Costa Rica, Denmark, Belgium, or Finland when it comes to freedom of the press. So there is a climate of social threat, social hatred towards journalists, but there's also a political and institutional threat for press freedom. What I mean is that there is a tendency that individual interests are ranked much, much higher than the public interest. So there is an institutional bias by many courts and many public institutions to neglect the freedom of the press and favor individual interests. So let me give you one example. There has been an attack on a high-ranking politician last year in Cologne during her electoral campaign for being mayor, and the day before the election she was attacked with a knife by a criminal and was nearly killed. Fortunately, she survived and she was elected mayor. Unfortunately, the court where the man is now standing trial ordered all journalists to pixelate the photograph of the criminal. My newspaper bill did not comply because we can afford to face any judicial challenge that might come out of it. Another problem is that although we do have a Freedom of Information Act in Germany, public institutions make it very, very hard for journalists to actually access the information they have a right to access. It's being made hard because, first of all, there were huge sums of money expected from journalists to be paid to actually receive the information. In one case, it was up to 15,000 euros. This, fortunately, has been fought successfully in court, but the trouble is that we have a situation in Germany, and I think in many other European countries, where freedom of the press is largely dependent on how wealthy the media company is you're working for. So I'm lucky to work for such a wealthy media company, but I, this is my last word, think that freedom of the press should not depend on the money and the means you can spend, but should be a right in itself. Thank you very much.
Tani, thanks very much indeed. Well, Tani mentioned there that the targeting of individual journalists and the very personal way journalist is no longer a messenger, an abstract messenger, but more an individual and stripped down, their personality is stripped down, or their being, or what they represent. And I say that because I want to introduce you now to Habiba Langre. She's a journalist in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where which side of the Congo you're reporting from and what you look like and what language you speak as a journalist determines whether you get the story.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a French journalist. My parents are from Burkina Faso, and I expatriated in DRC 5 years ago. Something came up quite quickly. It's that some people were thinking that I was a Tutsi, whether they be Tutsi Congolese or from other ethnic origin. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being a Tutsi, but in DRC this is problematic. Why? Because Rwanda was involved in 2 wars in DRC between 1996 and 2003. There were also other countries, but Rwanda was part of the war. And after that, Kigali was accused of supporting rebel groups in eastern Congo. So basically, looking like a Tutsi in DRC is looking like the enemy. I've never been insulted, I've never been assaulted, but I have to take into account how I look when I'm talking with people. Just 2 quick examples. For instance, once I was having a discussion with a senior army official, and he told me he was very suspicious of me in the beginning, and he told me it was because he thought I was a Rwandese spy. Which was very surprising, but this is what he had in mind, that I was a Rwandese spy. Another example is that someone close to President Kabila told me that if there was another Rwandophobic fever in DRC, as it happened years ago, I would have to be cautious not to be attacked, physically attacked, as it happened to the past to some Rwandese people. More globally, the DRC is preparing for a presidential election. The opposition is accusing President Kabila of trying to cling to power, whereas the constitution prevents him from running for a 3rd term. The tension is very high in the country. The opposition is being pressured. Activists are being pressured. And also journalists are being pressured. Journaliste en danger, Journalist in Danger in English, which is a Congolese NGO partner of Reporters Without Borders, and the UN Joint Human Rights Office reported harassment, intimidation, threats, and even arrests of journalists. So you have to be very cautious, and especially the Congolese journalists, international ones, are more protected from this kind of pressure. In this kind of, there is a topic where we are all equal. It's that we cannot demoralize the national army. The term is very broad, but to give you an idea, it's that you cannot give the death toll in the army ranks when it is too high, for instance. Journalist from Voice of America was expelled from DRC because he gave a death toll during when there was a rebellion in the east. The government was not happy with it. I don't know if the death toll was correct or not, whatever, but he was expelled without notice. And then still concerning the freedom of the press, concerning the security forces, I was said when I arrived in DRC that nothing works very fine in the country, but that the intelligence services work very fine. So very quickly, I had to find ways to interview people and protecting them, whether they be ministers, UN officials, NGOs, human rights activists, or just random Congolese people who need more protection, I would say, that the other categories I quoted before. So I shifted the traditional ways to make interviews to forgetting about phone interviews and face-to-face interviews to social media's interview via Facebook, via Twitter, or via WhatsApp calls, Facebook calls, chatting, to avoid being traced by the intelligence services and to protect the sources I have as much as I can. Of course, the system has its limits, and I was very handicapped. In January 2015, there were massive protests, essentially in Kinshasa, and Kinshasa decided to cut internet access, text messages, to try to break the gathering process of the people and try to weaken the protests in the city. So, of course, I had to go back to the old school, I would say, interviews, face-to-face, and phone interviews. And, of course, I think that my phone and the cell phone of other journalists was tapped at that time. So it was very stressful. I was very afraid that some of my sources would be arrested. Fortunately enough, it didn't happen. Thank you.
Habibul, thank you very much indeed. I think that the protection of sources is one of those key principles. It's a bit like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. And it's interesting in this environment, isn't it, when we're seeing increasingly, you talked about old school journalism, the new school journalism is the growth of the social media environment. And I mean, increasingly we're seeing it as a platform to increase access to information in a phenomenal way, particularly in the areas that we work in southern and eastern Central Africa. But I'm also curious to know, there are also pitfalls, surely. I've been in South Africa for a while, and we're reporting stories which perhaps would not make it on the news by virtue of the fact that people are also using that to abuse and use it as hate speech. So with no further ado, the man who's far more of an expert on social media than me is Bryn Musa. Bryn.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me here. I just want to talk a little bit about moving from protection of journalists to independent journalism and new technology. I run a media company called Riot, which specializes in virtual reality and immersive storytelling and news. We operate in 15 bureaus around the world in partnership with the Huffington Post. We're downstairs actually showing some of our films in the virtual reality hub, so if any of you have a chance, please come and see our films. We're at an extraordinary moment for media, for journalism, because of new technology. I started as a humanitarian in the Peace Corps in West Africa in 2001, where I lived for a number of years. And one of the first projects that I helped on was to work with the local government as they brought landlines into the country. This was 2001. And about a month into that program, cell phone towers began to pop up in the rest of the country. And this was a moment that we started to see throughout the developing world, where cell phones were replacing landlines, and communities would skip this sort of normal, I think, developmental step of going from landlines to mobile phones and just having mobile phones. Again, in Haiti, after the earthquake, where I lived for a number of years, we saw another technology spread, which was social media and the rise of internet access. This was another moment where we saw that technology was going to have, or could have, a profound impact on the way that we all communicate. I helped build a high school in Haiti, and those kids are all connected through social media, through Facebook, to the rest of the world. Even though some of them still 6 years later live in tents after the earthquake, I could pick up my phone and be able to check in with them or Facebook Live their lives, even though some of them live in the sort of most difficult conditions, without electricity, without running water, but somehow they're still charging their phones and accessing Facebook. So this is a moment, I think, that we have an extraordinary opportunity where really never before in the history of humankind have we been able to communicate so freely with one another, regardless of class or geography, where we can check in with each other, we can speak to each other through Facebook, through Twitter, through Snapchat, through Instagram. And so I think that well, a couple years ago, certainly what was exciting was through mobile phones, there was an opportunity for democratization of the distribution of content, where we could all have within our pockets the entire world's information at our disposal. I think now what we're seeing is the opportunity with the camera on the back of the cell phone, that we have the opportunity to democratize storytelling too. And I think that that's where our greatest, where the greatest opportunity lies for all of us as journalists and filmmakers, is that we have the opportunity now with this tool in our pocket, which is incredibly powerful, to be able to radically transform who are journalists, who are storytellers, who are filmmakers, and put the power back into the hands of people who for a long time have been marginalized through nothing other than just a lack of access to a platform. So I think this is the opportunity that we all see in front of us, and we're very excited to continue to explore it. Thank you.
Do you think unconditional access, when you talk about democratization of social media, is there a responsibility that goes with that? And we've had some powerful examples in war zones when there is no other access to information at all, and we've powerful voices that have come out. But do you think there's a debate, there's been enough of a debate about the responsibility that goes with that? Not necessarily in conflict zones, but in a broader humanitarian environment.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's the responsibility of the citizen to be thinking through all of those things. It's all of our responsibilities, I think, as platforms, to make sure that we help to curate that and help to rise the best stories to that occasion. But I think that this is a really incredible time where these voices can be heard, and I think that it will be really interesting to see how it works and what happens.
Thank you very much indeed. We've got some example now of where those amazing advances in social media have actually helped on the ground. Babita Basnet represents a media advocacy group in Nepal, to explain a little bit about how, in post-earthquake scenario, we're able to benefit from some of those tools.
Thank you very much, Karen. I will focus on my presentation how new technology played a role during Nepal's earthquake. I'll share my experience that, when earthquake was happened, and after some time we were so scared, and we ran to a house, to the open place, and we were like, we could not think anything that time, and it was very difficult kind of situation. And I got one SMS that was written, Dharara Telus tower in the country was collapsed. So it was the first message I got, that was mobile phone. So technology is used massively during and after the earthquake in the country. Especially mobile phone. Mobile phone was massively used by by general people, media personnel, and security personnel. So it was very, successful to coordinate each other for the rescue. So it was very helpful. And fortunately, we have lost many things, but our communication system was working. It was not destroyed. So it was our luck, we can say. And so after that, I can say that technology used that during and after conflict was internet and social media. That time, then our Prime Minister Sushil Koirala was traveling to Jakarta, and he got to know about our earthquake by tweet of Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India. That was the social media. So after that tweet, the whole world was informed about our earthquake, and attention was focused in the country. So role of social media, I can say that it was amazing by the youth, because of youth. Youth they are using massively social media, and that time they were using for collecting blood, because our hospitals were surviving, and they were facing crisis of blood, and so they were requesting to donate blood. They were collecting blood, they were donating blood, and not only that, they were saying that they were circulated that time slogan like "We will rise again." We lost our houses, some relatives, and our buildings are damaged and collapsed, but our heart is not collapsed, but our courage and confidence is not collapsed. So that kind of slogans were massively distributed, which was very inspiring kind of things. That time we were facing very difficult kind of situation. And also I want to talk about a little bit role of radio stations. FM and radio stations are very active in Nepal, even in our grassroots area. So that time what happened, so even general people, they were calling to radio FM station, and they were saying, in this particular district or this particular villages is happening this. So they were talking about dead bodies, they were talking about casualties, they were talking about, need help, some tents or blankets, So they were doing themselves they were playing role as a reporters. So we can say that, for the first time in our history, we practiced citizen journalism in the country. So it was very different kind of situation. They were talking. They are still using that kind of, because of mobile phone, because they had mobile phone at their hands, and radio station were accessible. So they wanted news. We wanted news that time. And also, I want to talk about a little bit security of journalism. We were not trained. We are still not trained. We were not prepared. And our FM and radio stations are still in. They were and still are in 4th or 5th floor. And Kathmandu is how crowded it is. Not only in Kathmandu, even in the district, And most of them, our news presenters are women. They were and still they are. And that time, I can say that, and aftershock were so frequent, and they were reading news and saying that, oh, again earthquake, it's happening, be safe, but they were not safe. And I don't say it was courageous kind of journalism we are doing, we are doing. It was very risky kind of journalism, but we did, So, and we are in risk still. And also, okay, but I think my time is finished. But what we realized, after this earthquake, that we have communication technology in the country, but we don't have that kind of technology in the crisis situation, which can be useful. Like we don't have cranes, we don't have special kind of helicopters, we don't have drone, and we don't have that kind, even alarms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Babita. Thank you. Well, nowhere have I seen the rollout of social media being so powerful as I have in Afghanistan, and in terms of voter mobilization as well. And I mention Afghanistan because we've just asked for an intervention from the floor. We've got a couple of people who will make interventions during the course of this session. But I'd like to invite Professor Saida Mojan Mostafavi to join us. He is the Deputy Minister of Publication Affairs from Afghanistan. I think he is with us now. She is there. My apologies, ma'am. Salam alaikum.
Ladies and gentlemen, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon. I want to share some stories about Afghanistan, and thank you so much, Chair, that you gave me this chance to share these stories. Fortunately, in the last 15 years, our country is one of the success story in the region for media development. For protecting of journalists' rights and promoting independent media and reporting, we worked in this area. In legislation area, in these past 15 years, we approved the mass media law, access to information law, and also copyright law and regulation about the establishment of private media activities. Constitution law and other mentioned law in our country is supporting and granting the freedom of expression, information and media. The regulation is one of the most effective documents that's supporting the security of journalists and also their right in our country. We got good success about the number of media in our country. During the 15 years we passed, we registered over than 1,000 media in Ministry of Information and Culture, and this is a kind of explosion of information in our country. Fortunately, beside of male journalists, there is a lot of female journalists in different fields that they are working for journalism issue in our country. Ministry of Information and Culture and 17 union of journalists are working and supporting the journalists' right in our country. We established about 8 commissions for the support and the right of journalists. High Council of Media, Investigative and Complaint Commission, Mass Media Commission, and also Access to Information Commission, Elimination of Violence Against Journalists Commission, Legal Committee, and Media Ethics Committee. Considering the situation of Afghanistan, despite much achievement, there are some challenges and problems also for journalists in Afghanistan. Violence against journalists exists in Afghanistan. 625 cases of murder and violence against journalists were registered within recent 15 years that unfortunately didn't investigated by legal organs. The expanded of culture of impunity in Afghanistan exists. 62 cases of murdered foreign and Afghan journalists were registered in Afghanistan during the past 15 years. In 3rd of May, we published a book about the murdered journalists in Afghanistan, and these cases are included 7 movie group and Tulu TV journalists that they were killed by the suicide attack last year. We are following all of these cases, but still we have violence against journalists in our country, and we are trying to solve in a better mechanism this problem. Thank you so much.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. And it's interesting, Voice of America are reporting 300 journalists have left Afghanistan in the past year because of fear of their life for security. So a very, very powerful testimony to that. Thank you. We're just going to turn now to our voice from the industry, from the industry in the Middle East. Mazen Hayek is here. If I could ask you to give your presentation, please.
Thank you. I've prepared a few notes, had to change them while hearing the courageous words in the hall. And Brian and Babita have covered the social media aspect. And I agree with Christophe Deloire that we need strong champions for press freedom. But more than a handful of colleagues and friends were killed in the region, in Iraq and in Lebanon, 10 years ago, and impunity still reigns till today. We don't know who killed them. We cannot lead by example and tell other journalists who push the envelope and try to uncover wrongs that this is the route to go. And look, impunity is not the name of the game. There is justice at the end of the road. I have to tell you also that we in the Middle East live in a catch-22. So a journalist covering MENA has to navigate between a car bomb, the risk of being kidnapped or assassinated, to deal with state and fierce non-state terrorist networks, and all kinds of intimidation on one hand, but on the other, you have hefty gifts and privileges and blank checks for those who comply with what people in power want. So you have to navigate between simply having access or no access, depending on whether you decide to question people in power or chief executives or not. And I have to remind us that in some of our areas of the world, journalists are more valued because of their access and closeness to people in power than the other way around, than their ability to question people in power. So the more you're close to power spheres and accepted by them and have access to them and you're able to promote what they do, the more you have access and ease of doing your job. In all cases, you have immense human sufferings across the board. The second point, there's a fatigue, there's an exhaustion in the Arab world vis-à-vis footage of crisis, of bloodshed, of human sufferings. We live in a region, since the eruption of the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1948, 60 years ago, 90% of news is bad news. So it's very hard for us to attract the attention of such an immense crisis like the refugee crisis. People are used to seeing kids on beaches torn apart, cut in pieces, and seeing there's a deja vu, unfortunately, there's a striking deja vu feeling about immense human sufferings on media. And there is something that we should do about it to remobilize people again, to be moved when seeing millions of people displaced and refugees, when seeing children and mothers going through immense human suffering. Yes, social media is big in the MENA region. It gives sometimes the voiceless a voice. The peer-to-peer recognition, the influencer status, the believability. I'm not sure about the credibility and the trust though, but we were able to deal with citizen journalists who, via Skype or other means in Syria and in Iraq, where we couldn't be present as a network. And as MBC, we've created few campaigns. One of them is Tweet to Donate, a campaign that for every hashtag, for every post, we will donate an amount of money to a cause. And I'd like to ask us together here, what about launching an engaging social media campaign for refugees and the refugee crisis with a donation drive, the same way it happened with the Ice Bucket Challenge. I mean, the Ice Bucket Challenge, I think, was linked to a cause that is important but not as alarming as the refugee crisis. Can't we come up with a mobilization social media campaign a la Ice Bucket Challenge, or what Melinda and Bill Gates are doing on polio and other crises, to engage people around what is the biggest human suffering since World War II? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. That sounds like quite a challenge. I never thought I'd hear refugee crisis and ice bucket challenge in the same sentence. Thank you very much.
And James Bond is around, so he can help us.
We should have a word with him, exactly. We have a couple of interventions still. If I may invite, please, the Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. José Manuel García Margallo, to take the floor, please.
Muchas gracias por...
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. A great American journalist, Walter Lippmann, once said that journalism is bringing to light aspects of reality which otherwise would remain in darkness. And this is especially true when we talk about journalism in times of conflict. The journalist who relates or who shows us the bombing of a hospital in Aleppo, or the effects of an attack by Boko Haram in a village in Nigeria, doesn't do it to satisfy a morbid curiosity. He does it to make visible the heart of darkness and to make sure that what is happening there is not ignored or goes unpunished. The journalist in times of conflict is civilization's witness for the prosecution against barbarity. And that is why the greatest example of barbarity in our time Daesh terrorism has in journalists one of its most fierce enemies. They know that the pen, the computer, or the camera are the most effective weapon against the lies of propaganda. It has been said that the main victim of war is truth, but unfortunately, too often, journalists are also victims of conflicts in their desire to reveal the truth. As we have to protect doctors and healthcare personnel who risk their lives to help victims in a conflict, we must also protect those who are there to preserve and to state the truth, to give voice to the victims and to identify their executioners, making sure that their actions do not go unpunished. And that is why, and also as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, Spain has made specific proposals when it comes to protecting, very specific proposals when it comes to protecting journalists. We want persecution and attacks against journalists in a conflict situation to be considered war crimes. And we want to promote a cooperation between the Security Council and the International Criminal Court in this respect. And we want the Special Rapporteur for the right of freedom of expression and opinion to report on the exile or the persecution that journalists are often submitted to, so many journalists, because they dare to relate the atrocities that they witness. Spain is also in favor of creating the position of a special rapporteur of the Secretary General of the United Nations for the security of journalists or safety of journalists. As you know, this is an initiative which was presented by the Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders, Mr. Touloir, who is joining us today, that Spain has formally supported through a letter to the UN Secretary General. This special representative would also play an important role in the UN system, carrying out work in the area of coordination, early warning, information, and the prevention of attacks and crimes against journalists. This is one of the most tangible commitments and concrete commitments that we would present in this summit. You can count on us and count on Spain to ensure that journalism can continue to bring light where darkness threatens to impose itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. We also have an intervention from the French Minister of State for Development and Francophonie, excusez-moi, André Vellani.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. We have gathered here today because the mission to inform in certain crisis areas remains too often something which is of extreme importance. I'm thinking of Syria, where dozens of journalists have been killed since the beginning of since the conflict. Their only crime was to show the indiscriminate repression which strikes the Syrian people, as well as the atrocities committed by Daesh. I'm thinking here of photographer Remy Oshnok and Edith Bouvier, who was injured by the bombs of the Syrian regime in Homsk. I'm also not forgetting here the victims of the obscurantist terrorism, Camille Depage, James Foley, and Stephen Sotloff. Now, in countries in the pangs of chaos, local journalists or invisible journalists often pay the highest price. And female journalists are, in addition to this, the victims of sexual harassment over and beyond situations of war. I would like this morning to denounce the attacks on the freedom of the media throughout the world, the whole world, and especially, very close to here, in Russia and in Egypt, as well, unfortunately, as here in Istanbul, in Turkey. I'm going to move on to crisis situations now. Freedom of expression must be respected everywhere. We have to consider all forms of protection which will enable these men and women, very brave men and women, armed only with their pens, their digital cameras, or their satellite phones, to continue to inform and document all the crimes which are committed in conflicts. 10 years ago, with Resolution 1738, the international community had committed itself to strengthen the protection of journalists in armed conflicts. Resolution 2222 in 2015 backed up this priority by reminding the parties to the conflict their obligations in terms of the protection of the freedom of the media and their obligations in terms of protection of journalists. However, these haven't been implemented yet. This is why France backs the request of Reporters Sans Frontières, even though it was presented this morning in English by the Frenchman Christophe Deloire. RSS request to create a special mandate under the Secretary General of the United Nations is essential. France, in keeping with its commitment in favor of freedom of the media and the protection of journalists, wishes to work alongside all states in good faith at the United Nations on this project. To quote the President of the French Republic, François Hollande, following the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, and I quote him, "Freedom of the media is an ongoing struggle because this freedom is one which has never been fully acquired, and France will continue the struggle alongside you."
Thank you very much indeed. I think my colleague from Reporters Without Borders actually possibly needs to consider a new profession as a political lobbyist. You're doing brilliantly. There's certainly a lot of support for this. We're of course being hosted by Turkey, and I would like to invite the Director of Media and Information of Turkey, Mansour Ozdemir, to address us briefly. Perhaps also support for the same idea.
Evet hanımefendi nazik söz.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and greetings to all of the participants. Turkey hosted the G20, then it hosted the Islamic Summit, and now we're hosting the World Humanitarian Summit. It's a pleasure for Turkey to be able to host the summit. It's also an honor. Turkey has the wisdom of Asia, and it has the depth of the Aegean as well as the Greek civilizations. So Turkey is a synthesis of many civilizations. So Turkey has played a key role in wisdom, in knowledge, in generating knowledge and information. It also puts a lot of emphasis on the ethical movement of knowledge. This region has a rich history of media. Recently, Turkey has become a key player in the global arena. We believe in peace, we believe in a world without conflicts, and Turkey has made significant contributions to reaching these aims. At this point, I'd like to bring up a couple of points that will hopefully contribute to the theme of our session. This goes back to some of the issues that were brought up, and I'd like to offer our support to some of the issues that were previously brought up. I'd like to talk about the journalism activities in Turkey, both within the public sector and outside the public sector. There are many organizations in the public and private sectors. We have the Press and Information Center that works under the Prime Minister's office. So that office works in cooperation with international players in offering professional services. Recently, we have had some issues in Turkey, especially issues involving Syrian refugees. We accumulated a lot of experience about covering these issues, and we now have a new understanding of the capabilities of journalists. We have an understanding of the regional values and the regional impact of journalists in especially covering conflicts. So we accumulated a lot of information and knowledge about the Syrian Turkey. Turkey has a very systematic approach to the accreditation of journalists. In addition, as it is the case in humanitarian activities, journalism must strike a fair balance between freedoms and responsibilities. In other words, people should be accountable for the steps that they take. So these discussions should be assessed from the perspective of this balance. We also have to think about the laws in publication. We have freedoms about the publications, and it's important that these freedoms not be abused for other purposes. So it's important that the media and the press discuss the ethical aspects of what they do. In Turkey, we understand that there have been some comments about accreditation. I should say that we're working on the accreditation of journalists, and I'd also like to give you our gratitude for giving us the opportunity to discuss this important issue here in Turkey.
Indeed. Well, we're running a little bit over time, so just before I thank my panelists, just to wrap up, we've touched upon a wealth of issues. I think no one in this room could have failed to be left without the impression that there is unanimous agreement, it would seem, that the role of journalism is one of a pillar in defense of democracy and in defense of humanitarianism, which is what we're all here for today. Again, we've had admission of compassion fatigue from representatives in the industry, very, very honest admission. We've had powerful testimony from my colleagues from Syria, also from the Democratic Republic of Congo, about the day-to-day challenges of reporting conflict. And we've had calls for a special representative, which we've already had a number of countries endorse, to try and champion the rights of journalists, both as advocates of independent reporting, but also champion the rights of safeguarding journalists in the work that they do. I'm going to hand over finally to Frank Larue. He's the Assistant Deputy General of UNESCO. Thank you to my panelists for sharing your stories, for sharing your insights. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to, because of time, finalize this great discussion and conversation we're having with three basic conclusions. Number one, it is true that we have had 8 resolutions at the level of UNESCO, at the Human Rights Council, at the General Assembly, at the Security Council. But it is also true that during this period, the amount of deaths and attacks against journalists has also increased. So we have more consciousness of states, of the role of journalism and the importance of journalism and the need to guarantee safety for journalists, but at the same time, we actually are living a period of violence and impunity in these cases. I think this is a reflection to make. It is true that these resolutions are very symbolic, very significant, but we have to make them a reality, and we have to bring to task every region, every state where these events are happening. Number two, I think we have in the safety of journalists a new framework that was approved by the General Assembly last year, which is the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda 2030. Why do I make this reference? Because before demanding a safety of journalists procedure implied the signaling a particular country, one or another, something that different states would react and reject. Today, no state can react that, because in Goal 16, we established that there is a need for development to establish transparency and access to public information, but also, more importantly, to guarantee public access to information, which means to guarantee a free press in a democratic society with participation of citizens. And this is crucial if we're going to link development in all nations and the agenda that is the responsibility of all the members of the UN. Then to have a mechanism of safety of journalists should be the responsibility of every single nation, whether it has a big problem or a small problem. But the political will should be manifested by every single nation, every single state who is a member of the UN, and they should be part of the reporting mechanism that we have every year to look at how this agenda is developing. And third, in this summit on the management of humanitarian crisis, it is very important to understand, and I think if there was any doubts, I think we have been able to clarify them, that in any humanitarian crisis, the role of journalists and the role of media is a paramount issue. Not only do they inform the world of what has happened, they informed the policymakers of where to design a policy and how to address the humanitarian crisis, but they also inform those that are victims of the crisis, and in this case, those that are refugees. Because behind every conflict, every war, or every natural crisis, there are human lives and human histories. These people have to understand that they are being seen, that they are being heard, that they have a voice, and that they also have a right to receive information of what the world is doing in their crisis and what the world is doing for them. Let's hope that this panel and this summit of humanitarian crisis will increase the level of importance we all give to an open and free press and understand the need to protect and guarantee the safety of every single journalist in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, certainly it seems that this is a critical moment in history to demonstrate that extraordinary role that the media does play. And I would just implore everyone, politicians, practitioners of journalism, people who have come here simply out of interest, not to squander this moment, because it really feels like this is an opportunity to remind people of the value of this work. To all my panelists, to the Director General, to the Acting Director General as well, thank you very much indeed for your participation. And to the rest of you, please enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you for joining us today.